The second was to sort of explain something of where something from an older project to do with open source and free software, and some ways I've been thinking about openness in that context. And then finally, I wanted to sort of share with you an experience that I had about what it is to sort of do open research, or research that's open in particular ways to particular kinds of contexts, and what that entails, both in terms of knowledge production, but also in terms of affect and how one's agency gets situated, and all of that sort of stuff. Which is that map there, but don't look at that for now. So actually, I'm sort of here not just as somebody to contribute ideas, but I'm hopefully looking to steal some and get inspired. My current interests are sort of to do with accountability and to do with notions of transparency. And specifically, Intel's business has shifted quite seriously from a notion of a kind of an individual user on an individual PC to things sort of moving out into the environment in fairly serious ways, both in terms of being able to sense activity more and more, so the proposition that there's lots and lots of sensors in the environment, that you can do location sensing more readily, environmental sensing, biological sensing, you name it, it's now more or less possible. And alongside that, the computer has changed from a single device to a number of different devices that are possible. And then the question then becomes sort of how do these things get composed in new and interesting ways, and ways that makes data valuable. And my question is, there are certain things you can do. If you think about the sensing that you can do in a house, right? One thing you could do potentially is to monitor your own energy use. If you have some data about what your neighbors are doing, you can start to make some inferences about, well, maybe actually the houses that we live in collectively, our developer didn't do such a good job on the insulation. We have some common interests to sort of band together and exert pressure to get that changed. You scale up even further and you start to be able to do different things. You start to sort of, make some claims about which country is actually meeting environmental standards in the way that it's promised, right? So my interest is really twofold. It's sort of figuring out at what scale do things start to become interesting for what kinds of computational powers. There's a sense, particularly at Intel, and I think in technology production more largely, that there's a sort of ego-centered notion of what technology should do. So there's this notion that, well, if I get all the sensor data and I have a personal device, that really what it's about is pushing more and more data at me individually. And so I'm in the midst of designing a research project that might interrupt some of that, which is one of the reasons why I'm so interested in this peer-to-peer urbanism, sort of notions of new sociality that might bring things together. Underneath that is really trying to understand, and I'm not quite sure how I'm going to do this, but trying to understand notions of what data is and what calculation is and what data actually counts for what, and how is it that data comes to count. And count in both senses, both in the literal sense of, we have histories of numeracy, we have ways of statistical reasoning that may or may not fly in non-professional accounts, right? So what does it mean to get together a bunch of environmental data and then find that nobody cares about it, right? Or in what terms are people differently positioned to actually care about that data is something that I'm concerned with. Which is all to say that I'm also looking for ideas. I don't know where I'm going with that, but it was slightly a plea for help. Right, so that's one piece of sort of, thinking about how data might be open to sort of different actors at different notions of scale. My second sort of thing to say has to do with openness in a different context, which is free software. So quite a while ago now, I did a research project with my colleague James Leach, now at Aberdeen, to look at the ways in which free software, open source software was gendered. And it wasn't quite clear what we would find, and we certainly found all the kinds of sort of gender-based exclusions that we find in lots of technology, sort of systems of technology production. But one of the things that gender showed up quite clearly that I think other issues perhaps didn't was the ways in which openness was constituted not as a way of building relationships with others, but actually as a way of cutting them, and as a way of cutting those relationships short and removing the ties that actually bind people together. So this is, in a sense, the opposite of a gift economy in many ways. And one of the reasons that I think we can make this kind of a claim is when you look at gender relations, one of the things that becomes quite apparent is that men, and I will say men because it is that's the source of the issue, is that, men will say, well, really, you can talk about this community stuff all you want in the lovey-dovey way, but really the point of free software is to build better code. And in the interest of building better code, I am going to say all sorts of nasty things about you. I'm going to shut you up. I'm going to exclude you from this community, right? So there's this sort of kind of a techno-fundamentalism here that's really about saying, and there's a certain freedom, a sense of almost a libertarian sense of freedom that says, this openness is really about me not owing you anything. That once I put my code out there, it's now distant from me. And it's like saying, take it, do with it what you like, I don't care. Right, because the IP protects it in certain ways. The code is what it is, right? So there's a sense of openness here that actually is not happy clappy at all, and there's a real cost to how we choose to do openness. And if openness is really about kind of aping commodity relations in a certain way and saying, all right, here you go, I have no connection to it anymore. It gets embedded in other code, other things. Then it's worth thinking quite carefully about what the costs are to openness, as well as the sort of the sense in which openness is also a sense of hospitality, a sense of sort of an invitation, right? I mean, there's potential here for there being particular there's potential for shaping openness in such a way that actually it excludes people. So one of the reasons that we started this research was a quantitative finding that, in fact, while open source is sort of open to anybody to participate, expert or lay person, you just submit the code. In fact, the rates of female participation were significantly lower than in proprietary software community, so working for a company, that kind of thing. There were real strong forms of exclusion here that were quite radical, and we think this particular version of openness that was actually causing that. I'm going to be really quick because I'm very hungry. Okay. My last sort of thing to say has to do with a project I did. I'm getting to the map now. That has to do with my own work at Intel. I've been an anthropologist at Intel for something like 5 years now, and I was concerned to do something a little bit different from my normal mode, which is you do a bunch of ethnography, you kind of you come up with some fantastic product idea about, this particular mobile device would be really great in this particular environment. And then, lo and behold, you find two things, I find two things hold true. One, I sort of mentioned yesterday, is that products, there's a sense in which a multinational company like Intel is poorly positioned to situate products in a particular context. So it kind of always has to produce for something global, right? Sort of dislocated from any sense of of real place or social situatedness. So, there would be this way in which ethnography would get used to sort of say, okay, well, if we add together the Russians and the Chinese and the Indians and the Brazilians, we'll get emerging markets, right? And you can sort of add in whatever, sort of ethnic stereotypes you can use to support that, right? So there was a sense in which there was a necessary kind of reduction of what it was we thought we were getting up to. The other thing going on was that, there was increasing sort of demand from the business for research into what the business calls emerging markets, right? So the problem was, well, what do we do in these emerging markets, and how do we sort of, sell technologies to more and more people who don't necessarily have them? It turns out that if you're Intel, people who don't have technology suspiciously have mobile phones, because apparently that's not a technology, but that's if you sell PCs, that would be true. And so this was framing, this notion of an emerging market was really framing more and more of the social science work. And, a few of us sort of became nervous about the way in which this notion of emergingness. So there's this, it's a term of art to talk about a market that's mature and a market that's emerging, right? As if you were somehow there's this child that sort of, needs to be brought into maturity in some way. And that way is very particular. It has everything to do with economics, right? So these are calls are made about mature and emerging markets as a fairly straightforward function of GDP. Right? So if you have sort of rising GDP, you can start to have a debate about whether this market is mature or this market is emerging. Everybody in this room can anticipate the problems with this. The critique of sort of progress, the critique of development is absolutely well known. And in fact, when I sort of raise this, in everyday meetings, I'll say, well, they're not crawling out from under a rock. I sort of raise this constantly, and people say, yeah, and I'll sort of say, well, what is it about Shanghai that's still emerging? Like, what do they have to do to have emerged? And I sort of say this, and people are like, yeah, well, it's silly, isn't it? But you keep going on with your business, because the BRICS are emerging markets, BRICS being Brazil, Russia, India, and China, right? Those are the emerging markets, so what do we do about it? That question does not change regardless of the critique leveled, right? Because it's embedded in the business. There are certain kinds of measures that are embedded in the business, and those measures sort of ingrain those stereotypes that sort of, people are increasingly worthy when they start to have money and look like us. So what I did, which was precisely, you can think of this in a bunch of different ways. You can think about this, so if the script is progress, right, sort of economic progress and development, what would the anti-script look like? You can think of it that way. You can also think a bit of it as we were talking about yesterday in terms of something that's both open and closed, and that I wanted to build something that was both open to certain possibilities, being that more straightforward anthropological critique was not helpful in this particular situation, but also closed in others. So what we did was we teamed up with a political scientist and developed what we call the TMI, the Technology Metabolism Index. We did eventually publish it, and we found that academic publishers don't like the term TMI. So it's the TDI, the Technology Distribution Index, if you're actually interested in what the guts of it are. And so what this measure does is it takes a number of technologies that Intel cares about and measures them in relation to the global share of wealth, right? So what these things are measuring is the amount of, say, PCs in a country compared to the global stock of PCs, compared to the amount of GDP dollars that country has relative to the amount of GDP dollars in the countries, right? So you have a ratio of ratios, sort of how much technology adoption is actually happening in relation to how much wealth there is, right? So by having this sort of relative measure, right, it made it, in our mind, much harder to sort of say, here are the mature countries and here are the emerging ones, because this map looks really weird if your job is to sort of make calls about mature and emerging, the whole point of it was to say there are these really exciting places, and we're not quite sure why. We're not quite sure what it is that's sort of driving this relationship between GDP and technology adoption. But there's something there, and it creates points of differentiation. The red ones are countries divided up into deciles. So the red ones are the top decile. The sort of middle dark gray is sort of meets expectations, right? And then you get sort of smaller and smaller and lighter. Right. So the point was to kind of make that a little bit more unassailable. This notion that technology is not being adopted because the poor are suddenly becoming less poor, right? That there's something more going on, And I have to say that it was that there's something about, so you can sort of see this as directly a product of hybrid knowledge, right? There's very clearly a certain sort of sensibility and critique of critique here. At the same time, it's quite businessy, right? It's deeply panoptical, and in a way that I don't think I necessarily feel comfortable with. This reflects none of my sort of epistemological commitments in a lot of ways, right? And yet there's something about this hybridity, there's something about this notion or an attempt to make one's work open that's not just about sort of shifting, being quite clever about who you share what with, right? So originally we did this as a blatant political move, right? It's sort of like, all right, if you really think emerging markets are this way, I'm going to show you differently. As a result of that, there's been all sorts of kind of reorganizations of affect and in ways in which one develops attachments to knowledge that get sort of radically shifted and undermined as soon as you start to do this kind of work. So, for example, it was absolutely exhilarating to see parts of the business actually use this as a way of selecting first ports of call for some of our low-cost computers, right? And it's sort of computers that were specifically designed to be for the emerging markets. Okay, we need a way of differentiating that. What's it going to be? That part was absolutely exhilarating. You sort of see your own, your ability to affect the world in that way. And yet, it's this thing that also gets beyond you, right? So it's also now this data set that gets used to sort of cheerlead for emerging markets, to say emerging markets are even better than you thought it was, because it's not just that we have this growth of the middle, what they call the global middle class, that also they're increasingly valuing PCs, and so it's this pitch for PCs, and it's absolutely gutting to see that happen, to sort of see this thing get twisted around, and yet at the same time, there's a way in which you can see that as an improvement, right? That it's not, you're bringing this light into the heart of darkness sort of rhetoric anymore. At least you need a little bit less. But there's something about a kind of, I'm sort of writing a paper about this now, sort of reflecting on the relationship between sort of so I'm trying to follow the sort of the Michel Calon, Danny Miller debates, and sort of to show up the idea that sort of embedding and disembedding knowledge, sort of bringing it from one context into the other, is not just this kind of academic theoretical framing, that there are sort of real costs to affect, and sometimes that's wonderful, and sometimes it's also incredibly painful. So for another example is I actually start to get into it, right? I mean, it does work on the self in a lot of ways. You start to look at this and you say, okay, well, actually, that is plausible. And it's sort of just emerging from graduate school, this work would not have been sort of interesting in and of itself. But it kind of, it's this, I made this object specifically so I would not have to be personally, charismatically kind of trying to change opinions, that this map would be between me and the business. and yet I find myself seduced into it in strange ways. That would be another version of openness and what happens when you attempt to be open. So I'll stop there.